This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's 3 minutes after 10 and a very good morning indeed to you. What a strange little conference this has been, and an important one. Tempting though it is to look away or to ignore that sense of sort of fatigued disgust that you feel whenever Suella Braverman starts blasting away on her various dog whistles. They're not even really dog whistles anymore. It's a hurricane. Did you know a hurricane of migrants is coming now? A hurricane. What will it be next year? A tsunami. There'll be what comes after a tsunami of people like her parents. I don't know. What would it be? I say fatigue disgust because I'm never on the receiving end of this sort of rhetoric. Obviously, well, I sort of am actually. I presume when she talks about because you can't really name anyone. This is what's so bizarre about this new iteration of the Tory party is that they talk about who their enemies are. All of these people who call you racist when you talk. Who are these people? I could off the top of my head, you've got Gary Lineker, Carol Vorderman, and me. Who else is there? And I don't have exactly what you'd call an enormous platform. I've got no complaints, but it's not an enormous platform. And Gary Lineker and Carol Vorderman don't even have jobs in the context of political broadcasting. Where is the I don't know, the anti-racist equivalent of the Daily Mail? What is it? What would it be? The Guardian? Come on. It's just bizarre. And speaking of the Daily Mail today, they haven't really written it's a really odd speech actually by someone called Quentin Letts, who's a curious character. And the very, very first line of the coverage in the cheerleader-in-chief newspaper at the moment, the very first line of the article is, "Predictable voices will hate it." How many times have I said to you over the last few years that they are moving towards a space where every single thing they do will be designed not to improve anybody's lives, but just to annoy the people that they consider to be their enemies? In many ways, the first indication of this was all of the people who insisted that they still supported Brexit, even as it fell apart around their ears, because it upset all the right people. Do you remember that phrase? It upsets all the right people. I think we've all been tempted to use that phrase in some circumstances, but when it's actually a platform for government rather than just a pithy throwaway line on social media, you've got a bit of a problem. Why are you doing that? You have all the levers of government. What are you going to do with them? Oh, we're going to upset all the right people. And then you got I don't know if you remember, the Remainer-teers. Do you remember the era of the Remainer-teers? When people who were being shown daily that they'd fallen for the biggest crock of shocking amounts of sewage since time began, insisted that they didn't mind the fact that they'd been lied to. I don't mind at all that my life hasn't improved in any measurable way, and that the food that Jacob Rees-Mogg promised me would be cheaper is now more expensive than ever before. I don't mind at all, because look at all those Remainer-teers. I'm drinking Remainer-teers. And you sort of sat here and thought, everyone enjoys a little bit of Schadenfreude. Particularly vintage Schadenfreude. I keep a few bottles of Schadenfreude in my cellar at home and crack open the corks on occasion. But you can't live on... Man cannot live on Schadenfreude alone. So taking pleasure in the misfortunes of your perceived foes becomes not only ridiculous, but also downright dangerous when the source of your perceived foes' unhappiness is bad stuff happening to everybody. So they've all started saying, people who talk our country down. And this is what you do. You say this, you say, people are talking our country down. Well, I love our country. And you sort of think, well, if you love our country, why are you allowing this sort of stuff to happen to it? We've got 1 million vacancies across various sectors in this country. The NHS crying out for new staff. But we're going to make speeches about why we don't want people to come here. Why are you going to do that? Because it upsets all the right people. 2023, a hurricane of immigration. 2024, a tsunami. 2025, I don't know what comes after a tsunami. And it does, of course, it upsets what Quentin Letts calls the predictable voices. But it's not a kind of, it's more of a, do you know, it's more like when you've got an incontinent cat that keeps peeing on your carpet and you keep thinking, maybe it'll stop. And yes, predictable voices will hate it. I wish the incontinent cat would stop peeing on the carpet. But it's so boringly unpleasant now. It's so predictably disgusting that you find your visceral reaction to it I don't know that it's diluting. It's just pathetic. Does this stuff resonate now anywhere beyond the editorial floor of the Daily Mail and their increasingly desiccated readership? Does it still land? Numbers are coming down for the Tories, but they're still at 27%. And then you look at an interesting development. I'm going to allow myself a brief pat on the back for this. I wrote in my first book, How to Be Right in a World Gone Wrong, that in order to stem the decline in this country, the media had to step up to the plate and start being a lot more robust with blatant lies. They had to start, for example, playing politicians, comments made by their colleagues, and insisting that they account for them before you would persist or continue with the interview that they had been booked to do. Ideally, you would play recordings of politicians themselves. You'd actually play the tape of them to the politician and say, what the hell were you talking about? That's a little bit harder to arrange. But the idea that you can now see, as we talked about yesterday, secretaries of state, an actual secretary of state, standing on stage in front of the party faithful and talking complete rollicks is incredible. But because it has happened incrementally, we haven't really registered how serious it is. You cannot... listen, all politicians are liars was that hilarious refrain that the bloke down at St. Stephen's Green used to intone whenever a microphone appeared, to the incredible annoyance of broadcasters and the amusement, perhaps, of those of us who haven't really matured quite as much as we probably should have done by this stage in our lives. But I look back now and think, oh, you absolute plum. They're not all liars. And also, there are gradations of lies. There are little white lies. There are embellishments. There is people who are an economé with the actualité. And then there are barefaced lies. And then, of course, context becomes important. The question of where the lies are being told. So, at a UKIP conference, you'd expect loads of lies and you'd never be disappointed. But at a Conservative Party conference, you'd probably expect the worst lies to be confined to the fringes. And even then, you wouldn't expect the lies to be as egregious as Susan Hall claiming that Jews were frightened of Sadiq Khan, as she did a couple of nights ago. So everything is shifting. They call it the Overton window in the context of political leanings. But it's not just the question of shifting to the right. There's a shift away from observable reality. And it, of course, in many ways begins with Brexit and the fact that Farage is dancing around Manchester like a sort of superannuated member of Black Lace. That's relevant as well. Push pineapple, shake that tree. There is obviously something there, because not long ago, most Tory members would have quite rightly turned their noses up at his particularly pungent brand of jingoism and ignorance. But that's who the Tory party is now. And once they've embraced that, then I guess the lies will follow. And my God, the lies. It's actually incredible. And I don't know that there's any two sides to it anymore. You can say, well, Labour would be worse, and I'll give you a lollipop and tell you to stay away from scissors. But you can't, or I suppose you could say, well, there were no weapons of mass destruction. And you'd think, yeah, okay, that's absolutely relevant to a conversation in 2023 about a Secretary of State claiming that councils are going to stop you from using roads or limit the number of journeys you can make or whatever it may be. It's just bonkers. And finally, journalists are beginning to push back against it. On Newsnight last night, Victoria Derbyshire did an absolutely brilliant job, which listeners to this programme will be quite familiar with, the technique or the tactics. But better late than never, lads. Thank God the BBC has now caught up. Have a listen to this with what is she, the Secretary of State for Culture? Is it Michelle Donnellan? This is the only way you can do it now. But also listen to how blithely and how cynically the politician involved just sort of attempts to ignore reality and continue down a path of fantasy.
In your speech today, you said something that really struck me. You said, we are the party of facts. I wonder if I could ask you to just have a little look at this, please.
A government diktat to sort your rubbish into 7 different bins.
What is sinister and what we shouldn't tolerate is the idea that local councils can decide how often you go to the shops.
It's no wonder that Labour seems so relaxed about taxing meat.
How can you be the party of facts when none of that is true?
We are the party that stands up for facts, and my announcement today...
I'm going to pause you right there. None of those three things are true.
Well, it certainly is true. There are a lot of people that have been calling for a meat taxation. And it's this government that have been stemming
I'm not going to let this go. There was never a proposal to use 7 bins. We can't find any council that wants to decide how often people can go to shops. And Labour have never proposed taxing meat. They are untruths, they are fiction, they are completely and utterly made up. And it's really disrespectful to voters.
All hail Victoria, Derbyshire. It's really disrespectful to voters. That is the point. And then, of course, there is Andrew Boff being slung out of conference for sort of mild muttering in protest at some of the bile coming out of Suella Braverman's mouth. But what that Newsnight clip picks up on is something truly remarkable and something profoundly dangerous. Because you could say, and I would disagree with you, but we would be at least engaging on an agreed playing field and playing by agreed rules. You could say that this is nothing new. Politicians always tell lies and they're all as bad as each other. But they're not just doing that. They're standing on stage, and she's the Minister for Science and Innovation, I think. She's standing on stage and saying, we are the party of facts, even as they lie as a governing party in a proper free democracy has never lied before. That's not true, is it? Because Donald Trump, I suppose, was a governor. But anyway, they are claiming, not just lying, but they're claiming to be the party of facts. Now, that is cultish behaviour. It's possibly fascistic, but it's not just the lie. It's the claim that we are telling the truth even as we lie. That's just not normal. And there are lessons throughout history of these examples. It's not just the lie that is egregious. It's the claim that you're the ones telling the truth, because it's actually quite hard to argue. You will remember, I think, that Boris Johnson finally sort of fell victim to his own dishonesty, because that claim, nobody could know what was going on in my mind, that is actually, I mean, it's a tactic of coercive control. It's designed to allow you to essentially frame your own reality, which is at odds with observable reality. Ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears, said Big Brother in 1984. Ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. That is the party's final command. And that's what they're doing now. Listen, I have touched on and tickled and flirted with the Orwellian comparisons almost for as long as I've been doing this job. Certainly for as long as I've been awake while doing this job, which I've got to be honest with you, was not for the first few years. I was kind of just going along with the flow. But since I've come to understand how things work, that line there of actually, I mean, and Orwell knows of what he speaks, doesn't he? The idea that you are now being told to ignore the evidence of your own eyes and ears, not just by the media, which wouldn't be that new, but by secretaries of state, by cabinet ministers. It's incredible, right? It is conditioning, writes Page. If they can condition people to believe the lies, then they can tell any lies they like. They've learned from Trump. It's as simple as that. They've seen Trump and they've seen Boris, and they've seen how few consequences there are. It's a great point. It's as if they're now experimenting, which is why Victoria, Derbyshire and others pushing back is so important. But it's also why, don't forget, they're setting up their own television stations. And they've already tested the water by telling lies about vaccines or telling lies about lockdowns. What lie? They're pushing it constantly. What lies can we tell? And then, you know, if they're worried about being called out for their lies, they're very picky and very choosy about where they appear. It's ridiculous that the Prime Minister hasn't appeared on LBC, one of the biggest platforms, the biggest commercial speech station in history, let alone in the country. Absolutely absurd that the Prime Minister wouldn't appear live on LBC prior to his conference speech. But he'll appear on GBB's probably, or a radio station owned by Rupert Murdoch. They're trying to create a media environment in which their lies don't matter. And I worry, hand on heart, and if you follow this programme closely, you'll know I can say this with both evidence and complete sincerity. I worry we've left it too late. What happens if the Tories lose the next election? Do you think they'll learn the lessons of lying, or do you think they'll think we didn't lie enough? I do not know. But I do know this. It's already 18 minutes after 10 and I've got a sense in the back of my brain that I've barely drawn breath. So I should probably pause briefly, remind you that this is officially a phone-in programme and give you a quick heads up on what the question is likely to be when I've got to the end of my own fulminations and pontifications this morning, which is likely to be at around 10:30. So the number you need is 0345 6060 973 and the question I want you to answer is this. What has happened to the Conservative Party? And I want you to answer it from the perspective of someone who has voted for them, ideally quite recently. What has happened to the Conservative Party? Talk me through how and why you think the party has ended up in a place where Hugo Rifkind of The Times describes it perfectly just in the last hour. He says, all the strategy seems to be predicated on the idea of a huge amount of Britain having views and obsessions that Britain in general has in no way indicated that it actually has. How has the Tory party ended up with cabinet ministers telling blatant lies on stage and their colleagues falling apart in broadcast interviews as they try to defend them? What has happened to the Conservative Party? 0345 6060 973. We'll start with Tory voters and ideally even members, and then we'll broaden it out a little later. But if you want to if you want to be front of the queue, if you want to come out of the blocks at 100 miles an hour, if you want to mourn for the party you loved, for the party you supported, the party perhaps of Michael Heseltine or Ken Clarke, or the party even of William Hague or Rory Stewart, the party of David Gork, I don't know, the party of Anna Soubry. What has happened to the Conservative Party? How has it ended up here? It's 10:20.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 10 is the time. So I may regret this later in life. I may regret it later today. But I don't subscribe to the footballification theory of politics. It's unlikely that I'd ever vote Conservative. I voted for Boris Johnson to be London Mayor in 2008, but that was me falling for the sort of cult of personality rather than a party political issue. But I don't look down on people who do. I think I'd struggle to understand a vote in the next election, given what's happened over the last 13 years. But in 2010 or 2015, and even 2017 or 2019, I could get my head around it. So don't feel unwelcome. Don't feel alienated or judged. Please don't. It'd be really daft and very defeatist of me. But what's happened to the party you vote for or have voted for in the past? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973. But first, a little bit more evidence to support the question. This is the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, lying.
But what is different, what is sinister, and what we shouldn't tolerate is the idea that local councils can decide how often you go to the shops, and that they ration who uses the roads and when, and they police it all with CCTV.
Here is Claire Coutinho lying.
It's no wonder that Labour seems so relaxed about taxing meat. Keir Starmer doesn't eat it, and Ed Miliband is clearly scarred by his skirmish with a bacon sandwich.
Oh, God. Here is Susan Hall, the Conservative candidate for London Mayor, lying.
I know how frightened some of the community is because of the divisive attitudes Lee Khan. One of the most important things that we can do when I become Mayor of London is to make it safer for everybody, but particularly for our Jewish community. So I will ask for as much help as I can get in London, because we need to defeat him, particularly for our Jewish community.
Here is Michael Gove lying.
We're not just the party of opportunity and ownership, we're the party of beauty and nature. And that is why we will resist the proposals of the Labour Party, and now the Lib Dems too, to build all over the green belt and to destroy precious natural habitats. Labour must not be allowed to take our fields, meadows and forests away from our children, and we will stop them.
And here is the Conservative chair of the London Assembly, exercising freedom of speech at the Conservative Party conference.
We don't challenge this poison. Things just get worse.
There's no such thing as gender
Whole
ideology.
institutions become captured.
No.
And of course, as always happens when the left gets the upper hand, those who fail to conform are persecuted, chased out of their jobs for saying that a man can't be a woman.
That's the Conservative chair of the London Assembly. At one point, quite a high-profile contender to be the Tories' candidate for London Mayor, a chap called Andrew Boff, spoke to Nick earlier. That's not a Just Stop Oil protester or an infiltrator from the left. It's not an anti-war protester or a Extinction Rebellion activist. It's a Conservative politician, quite a high-ranking Conservative politician in the London hierarchy, being thrown out of the Conservative Party conference. I'm just reading now that John Crace, the Guardian sketch writer, has been banned from attending the Prime Minister's speech. None of this is normal. What's happened? 0345 6060 973. What's happened? And I'll take anything you've got, but ideally from a position of having been supporter more recently. The more supportive you were more recently, the more interested I am in what you think explains this catastrophic collapse. George is in Portsmouth. George, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. It's a pleasure to call into your show today. Long time listener and fan. Well, I've been back in 2019. I only got engaged with politics, I was a teenager, and I found the populist rhetoric of Johnson to just be fascinating, and I fully supported the party at the time, and saw his ideas as very engaging and interesting. But, over the years, whether it be the economic turmoil we've been in, the absolutely repulsive Enoch Powell levels of rhetoric on immigration, or the climate denialism on display by cabinet members and senior officials in the Conservative Party, I've come to the conclusion that the Conservative Party has descended into a fascist pipeline. We've seen this with Braverman and her immigration stances about integration and multiculturalism. We've seen, I believe that the transport sector is spreading anti-Semitic 15-minute city nonsense.
Why is that anti-Semitic? Just out of interest, is it a New World Order type thing?
Yeah, it's a New World Order type thing. It originated from the QAnon group.
So there is such a thing as 15-minute cities, as we discussed yesterday, but they are not designed to do any of the things that the conspiracy theorists claim that they are designed to do. And it speaks to a secret cabal of puppet masters trying to control the population, and that is, of course, historically quite a well-established anti-Semitic trope.
Yeah, precisely, James, yeah. And overall, this kind of divisive nature of separating us from them and talking about whether it's the Rokarati, the global elite, the
blob, the woke mob, the tofu-eating Wokarati, the anti-growth coalition.
Exactly. It's all groups of...
And what's the Daily Mail today? First line of a speech. Predictable voices will hate it.
Yeah,
predictable voices will hate it. Well, tell me about the people who love it.
It's
so what's
insane,
happened then, George? Well, how do you? Because that's a nice digest. Actually, it's a very nice digest of evidence-based observations and descriptions. But the broader direction of traffic is explained by what?
Unfortunately, I think that's growth in the European far right, and it's kind of infected our country as well. You see this whether it's in Spain, Germany. France, it's just taking over the entirety of Europe, and we've been affected by it.
It's a sort of 20 to 25% that are historically receptive to this kind of rhetoric. And I've seen Rory Stewart make this point, and he, of course, is better placed than most to chronicle the decline of a party that he was quite a senior member of until relatively recently. And the calculation would be that you shore that up and then hope that it grows. So that would explain Braverman, but it wouldn't explain Mark Harper talking gibberish about road use, would it? Or would it? I don't know. I'm asking you.
Gosh, I'm not sure, actually, on Mark Harper. He's a very confusing figure. I just think that this kind of...
We've got to throw something. We've got to throw something at the wall, and we can't throw achievements at the wall, so we've got to throw division. Exactly.
Division is one of the biggest tools of a fascist movement. They rather than focus on the actual issues at hand, whether it be the economy, the climate, or
whatever it is, transport infrastructure, you name it.
Exactly.
Then you just keep telling people that they are under threat. You keep telling people that there are, and it's so weird to come from government, and that's why I haven't, and I think at almost any point previously in this program, I would have just picked you up slightly on the use of the F word, but I'm not going to do that anymore. That's a proper shift in editorial policy on this program. If you, like George, can back up your use of the F word with evidence and explanation, then I am absolutely going to let it stand. I may even join in. Just to clarify what Rory Stewart has said that backs up what George has said, there's a clear European playbook here, which is mobilising 20 or 25% of the vote with this language, now in Germany, France and some of the Nordics. Braverman is clearly betting that it will only grow. So that's what she's doing. And of course, many people, particularly people who have a similar background to her, as in a very recent family history of immigration, regardless of ethnicity, find that the knowledge that the people she's wooing would have been the people calling for your own parents to be deported particularly difficult. But unless you've got a better explanation of what's going on, then George's deployment of the F word stands. It's 10:31, 0345 6060 973. Conservative supporters who want to have a crack at explaining what's happened to their party. I am, as they say, all ears. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:35 and you are listening to James O'Brien on at LBC. The 27% of people in the latest poll still supportive of this iteration of the Conservative Party are fascinating and in some ways speak to Rory Stewart's explanation of what's happening in Manchester, which is the tradition across Northern Europe of roughly 20 to 25% of the population being up for it, up for the fascism. Or the crypto-fascism, or the quasi-fascism, or the fascist-adjacent rhetoric and policies. Rhetoric like a hurricane of migrants heading to a country with 1 million job vacancies. Oh, what a terrible prospect that would be. But to see all of them lining up to share various nonsenses about bins and meat taxes and 15-minute cities and road rationing, as with all conspiracy theories, there's always a little kernel of truth somewhere. Even if your council has introduced 7 bins, the idea that this is an issue of national political importance, or B, something that is going to be policed by the bin waffer is clearly absurd. They can't even arrest shoplifters. You think you're going to get into trouble for putting a tin can in the glass bin, then you're daft, or rather you are relishing being daft. Because another thing that occurred to me this morning, looking at the Telegraph rather than the Mail, was a commentator called Camilla Tominey describing Suella Braverman's speech as a real crowd pleaser. And that stopped me in my tracks because I think she sort of accidentally said the quiet bit out loud. It's how can it be a crowd pleaser to tell people that they're about to be swamped by a tsunami of foreigners? And the answer, of course, is that they really want to hear it. They love it. It's why the queue for the ghost train is always 100 times longer than the queue for the speak your weight machine. I want to be terrorised because I've been radicalised. And I want my prejudices to be reflected back from the podium at the Conservative Party conference. So the prejudice, the quasi-racism, the jingoism, the xenophobia is easier to understand perhaps than the other lies, such as, of course, Mark Harper's and Claire Coutinho's. So what has happened? What has happened to the country in general, but the party in particular? Helen's in Yeovil. Helen, what would you like to say?
I've got an interesting crossover on this.
I'll be the judge of that, madam.
My grandparents were Hungarians who fled the Second World War and became English immigrants.
Like Dominic Raab, like Dominic Raab's dad.
Oh, is he?
Yep.
Another Hungarian, is he? I didn't know that. There's one bad apple everywhere, isn't there?
Well, you can say
that. They brought my father and my uncle over to the UK and they started up in business and they were Tory voters all their lives.
Yes.
And when I started to vote, I did the thing that a lot of teenagers used to do. I think they're better informed now. And I voted the way my parents voted.
Yes.
And then I went into business for myself and I continued to believe that the Tory party were the party that had the most resonance for me. And I voted Tory all my life, but I will never, ever vote for them again because Boris Johnson has created a swamp of career politicians, and the only thing they're interested in is their careers and not the country. And the other thing about Johnson is he's bred a culture of complete lies, and we're seeing this now at the party conference. I'd love to be able to vote Lib Dem and make my vote worth something,
yes.
But I think the only way I can go next election is to do something I never thought in my life I'd say, and that's to vote Labour.
I understand. I think you've explained yourself very well, and I like the points the points of departure, if you like, from your traditional voting habits. That line there, I watched Liz Truss, Helen, and thought, while the rest of us were kind of goggle-eyed at the depth of Johnson's deceits, never mind the sort of moral depravity, just the blatant lies. We all watched goggle-eyed, including, you and I have very different voting histories. Liz Truss was taking notes. And then this conference is almost the apotheosis of that note-taking process. You've sort of got a generation of senior Tories, right up to the cabinet, who've watched someone slide all the way to Downing Street on wheels of lies. And so they, rather than thinking, God, we've got to turn this around, we've got to rescue our party from these depths of dishonesty, they've thought, crikey, you don't get into trouble for lying anymore. So I'm going to fill my boots.
They kind of also know they are not going to get back into power. Therefore, who do you look after then? Your own backside. And that's, to me, what each and every one of them is doing. I've got to say, I watched that Partygate.
Did you watch it? Was it any good?
Do you know something? I expected it to be a bit of a spitting image joke thing, and it was hard-hitting, and it was so well put together, and I turned the TV off and I felt sick with disgust.
Gosh.
I really genuinely did.
Because, and there's more emerging today. I don't know if you've seen what Patrick Vallance has been saying about what was going on in Downing Street as we were sort of trusting them to lead us through that particular. I've got some good news for you, Helen. Actually, Dominic Raab's dad was from Czechoslovakia, as it was then, not from Hungary. My mistake.
Excellent.
So you don't have that fellow feeling. That's excellent. Thank you to Gabriella for reminding me of that, or rather correcting me. Helen, thank you. I mean, that is it, of course. But the mystery for me is why you're not more Helen. That 27% of people. So let's make a little list. So part of it would be I could never vote Labour in a million years because, and that's fair enough, I suppose. Part of it would be that, they're bound to be worse. Or how many of that constituency just like the lies? I always remember the caller years ago, and we've been pretty good at this. If you've been listening to this programme over the last few years, then you will be among the least shocked people in the country by what is happening and what has happened. Because it wasn't that long ago, was it, that Donald Trump came into this country on a tidal wave of Islamophobia that was being directed at our own mayor, our own elected Muslim mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and a foreign leader was coming over here and attacking him and being praised and courted, nearly used a slightly inappropriate word there, by people like Nigel Farage, who'd insisted that when Barack Obama told the truth about what Brexit would mean, that foreign leaders shouldn't get involved in British politics. So the almost unimaginable scale of the dishonesty and the hypocrisy that Farage represents has now moved into the very heart of the Tory party. But you remember the caller who said, because we were doing something about the lies of Donald Trump, I think he was giving a speech and describing what was happening outside, and we had footage in front of us of what was happening outside, and it bore no resemblance whatsoever to what he was claiming. And someone rang in, I forget his name, but he's in one of my books, and he just said, I know he's lying, but I love it because it really upsets you and Sadiq Khan. It really upsets you and people like you and Sadiq Khan. I still don't quite know what he meant by that, but I can tell you that the front page of the Daily Mail today, reporting upon Suella Braverman's speech, and the top line, the single most important sentence is this: predictable voices will hate it. And they can't really tell you who they mean, because apart from Gary Lineker and Carol Vorderman, there aren't really many people with platforms calling out the madness that Helen has just described with voices that are likely to be heard beyond their own sitting rooms. It's coming up to 11:15. Zoe Gardner will join us after this break to look at this hurricane rhetoric of Suella Braverman. She's an independent migration policy expert and a particularly useful guest because, of course, there are issues and problems to be addressed. But if they're not addressed internationally and intelligently, they get bigger, not smaller. And of course, the failure in this country to have a proper conversation about any of these issues is part of the reason why the space has been created for hideous rhetoric about hurricanes and the rest of it. Should I squeeze any in? I don't think I've got time, actually, Ian. So I'll come to you first. I'm probably going to stay with this right up until the point that Rishi Sunak starts speaking. But I will throw it open a little further on not necessarily having to have a history of voting Tory, although you can see why I prefer that. How many days a year do we say you can only ring me if you're a Tory voter, historically? It doesn't happen very often, but on some days I think it's really important. And the day of the Tory leader's speech at a Conservative conference where Tory politicians are being thrown out for exercising their freedom of speech is probably quite a good day to say, what do you, as a Tory, make of what is going on? It's 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:48 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are just picking over the bones, really, of not just the Conservative Party conference, but the modern Conservative Party, a party which is unrecognisable from just a few short years ago, not just to outsiders or critics of the party, but also to members past and present. But I just want to step back for a moment. I saw a tweet by one of my favourite commentators the other day, which said, in the UK media, I'm never invited to speak as an expert with over a decade's experience of immigration policy research to explain what the evidence tells us about what works and what doesn't. I'm always invited on as one side of a debate on how to stop the boats. No wonder we get nowhere. And I thought to myself, well, there you go. That's easily rectified. We might not be the entirety of the UK media, but we punch above our weight, and so we will fix that now. Zoe Gardner is an independent immigration expert, and she joins me now without anybody sitting on the other side of the table shouting about how we should deploy giant hovercrafts or possibly electric cattle prods on the front of big boat. I don't know. 10:49 is the time. Zoe, I'm going to hand the floor to you if that's all right, and you can talk us all through what you heard yesterday in Suella Braverman's speech and what you thought most significant and what you think the ramifications are for either of the two major parties.
Thanks so much, James. Thanks for having me. I mean, I've got to say, it really is a great opportunity when you don't have to be just sort of shouting to make your point and be heard and actually get into the detail of this, because I think that's what British public deserve. And we deserve a whole lot better than what we got in that speech yesterday. Suella Braverman's Tory conference speech, which wasn't really the speech of a Home Secretary. It was a pitch for the leadership of the Tory party. But it benefited from the advantage of being Home Secretary, which means that she didn't have to address things that normally a candidate for the leadership would. So, for example, the longest NHS waiting times in our history, the fact that workers in the NHS were out on strike again this week, the fact that the cost of living is spiralling. These are the issues that, we would expect a hopeful for the leadership of the country to be addressing and talking about. But instead, of course, she focused her whole speech on talking about migration and demonizing migrants. So she opened it in this really despicable way. I think we've got a clip.
One of the most powerful forces reshaping our world is unprecedented mass migration. The wind of change that carried my own parents across the globe in the 20th century was a mere gust compared to the hurricane that is coming. Because today, the option of moving from a poorer country to a richer one is not just a dream for billions of people. It is an entirely realistic prospect.
Now, that could go down in history as the ultimate statement of pulling up the ladder behind you, couldn't it? This is a woman who is speaking with no sense of irony whatsoever, in the exact same way that people and politicians spoke about her parents' generation when they moved to the UK. And in fact, we should look at that, because we look back on the Ugandan Asians who came to the UK when they were driven out by Idi Amin. We look at the Windrush generation who came to the UK after the World War II and helped us to rebuild. And we look back on that and say that was brilliant. We built a future for this country that was worth having. We built the welfare state. We built the NHS. We did all of that with the help of those migrants together. But at the time, those migrants faced the exact same rhetoric from politicians, just like Suella Braverman, right? We were being told at the time that it was very dangerous, that everybody from the Commonwealth, especially the black ones, were likely to come to the UK, and that we would then be overwhelmed and our infrastructure wouldn't be able to cope, and that we would no longer be, of course, a white country. And that was what was behind it then, and it's what's behind it now again. So what we need to do to fight back against this rhetoric is recognize that when the Windrush generation came, and when the Ugandan Asians came, and when Suella Braverman's parents came here, what we did with those migrants is we worked together to build huge infrastructure projects that made this country so much better for everybody. To do that, and we could do it again, but not under this government, not under this Tory government, because this government has shown us that they are completely against the idea of investing in the infrastructure that we need. Whether this isn't about migration, this is about the simple needs of the future for this country. We need to build infrastructure. The Tories have fallen short by 100,000 homes on their own paltry targets for house building in the last year. They've fallen short year on year on their targets for building houses. They've just been announcing, their big announcement from this conference is that they're scrapping half of HS2. These are big infrastructure projects that this country needs to invest in order to be fit for the future. And what Suella Braverman is telling us here is she's not only signaling to the racist elements in our society, who I think are actually very few, much fewer than in Enoch Powell's day.
Do you?
I think she's saying
you're right.
Dream smaller.
Yeah, well, Rory Stewart this morning has suggested there's 20 to 25% of populations in Northern Europe who are susceptible to this sort of rhetoric. So, I mean, that's the gamble, that's the calculation. I'd hope you turn out to be right, and then I suppose other people will hope that Suella Braverman turns out to be right, and that constituency will grow. But what do you say to people who are not racist, but who are troubled by the pictures that she paints, and they are very intoxicating, they are very seductive pictures, which is why, you know, Enoch Powell's name is still very much on the lips of politicians and pundits, and why Suella Braverman's rhetoric is so reminiscent of his.
Well, I think that that's the vast majority of people in this country, right? I mean, the vast majority of people in this country are decent, they're warm, they're welcoming, they want to help refugees, they accept that migration is good for the country, but they want to feel a sense of control. They don't want to hear these insane, massive numbers being
we've given up on numbers. It's hurricanes now. Hurricanes tsunamis,
now, exactly.
Nuclear explosions of immigrants.
The paranoia that goes with this, and the fear that it's intended to generate, is intended to make you think that this is the biggest issue in the country, not the NHS, not the cost of living. Actually, you should go out and you should vote at the next election based on the possibility of these scary numbers of foreigners coming, when the reality is, right? I mean, she talks about an increase in migration there. Actually, globally, about 3.5% of the population of the whole world is a migrant. That's pretty steady over the past decade.
Is that right?
We've not seen a significant increase. And the vast majority of migration happens within countries and within regions. And what we do in the UK is we actually stifle that. So we have deals made with African countries to control their borders, and erect detention centres and lock people up who are trying to cross their borders. Those are the same African countries that have in the African Union Constitution the intention to move towards freedom of movement for African citizens between their borders. So we actively work against the kind of migration that works best, which is regional circular migration around the world.
We've abolished it for ourselves, and we work against it elsewhere in the world. What else? I don't want to run out of time, Zoe. What else caught your ear yesterday?
Well, I think that it was really interesting when she turned her fire on Keir Starmer at the end, and I think we've got another clip there.
The British people have no enthusiasm for Sir Keir Starmer. They know that he believes in nothing. They know that he will say anything to anyone and then change his mind at the first sign of trouble. Keir Starmer lacks the personality to lead this country effectively. Imagine what would happen if he became Prime Minister. Luxury beliefs would reign supreme. Britain would go properly woke.
I do worry when I imagine what would happen if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, as I think is likely that he will. And I think that insult will have really stung because I think that there's some truth to it. I think he does lack a bit of that vision and a bit of that personality that people want. And I think those people that we were talking about, James, those people who make up the majority of Britain who are decent, they want something to believe in. So I really hope that what a Labour government will do is not just what they've set out so far, which is the basic bare bones of a decent system. You have an asylum system, you process people's claims quickly, you don't keep them banged up in barges and hotels, you move them through the system, you protect refugees. That's the basics, and that's great, right? But actually, that's also the system we had that led us to this Brexit, to this Trumpization of our politics that led us to Suella Braverman. So they also need to think bigger and think further and look at, actually, one of the things that Braverman was right about was to question the Refugee Convention, not in the way that she did it, but in the sense that we have left it, as people who believe in protecting people around the world, we've left it, we've said, we've got that in place, my gosh, let's just hold that steady. And actually, we need to go much further. We need to recognize that far from what she's saying about these absurd numbers that are all made up, most people could never obtain protection under the Refugee Convention. They don't qualify. But lots of those people will have good reason to move anyway, whether that's because it's the best survival strategy in the face of climate change, whether it's about finding work and moving around to find better opportunities for the future. All of those things we don't actually provide for. And that's what's created these uncontrolled routes of migration happening. So Labour needs to take that seriously and address the needs of that population.
It's very hard to pick things that highlight much of or enforce much of what you're saying, and I forget which one it was, but there was a Conservative Party politician this week urging us all to have more children. So sort of bizarrely recognising the need for much of what you've just described, but concluding that the solution is to encourage people to have children that they currently don't want to have. It's incredible.
Yeah,
right?
It's fun that we're full and we can't take any more until it comes to, controlling the reproductive rights of quote unquote our women. Of course, the right women. Not the poor women who need benefits to support their children.
No, down with them.
A very small group of women need to be providing these kids for our future.
More and more children until the point where they can't afford to have any more children, at which point if they accidentally have another child, of course, they won't get any help or support from the state for them. I just need to clarify a couple of things. Do you have a second home in Tuscany?
I don't have a second home in Tuscany.
Because I was told by the Home Secretary yesterday that everyone who has a problem with her rhetoric and policies must have a second home in Tuscany. And
I think if we look at who's more likely to have second homes, it's probably the Tory politicians we've got right now, or the billionaires who have got richer over the last 10 years of Tory government in this country, whereas the rest of us have all been getting poorer.
And the final question is, do you know what a luxury belief is, Zoe Gardner?
I think a luxury belief is the belief that we don't need to tax corporations any higher. A luxury belief is the belief that we don't need to tax inheritance or wealth. That's the kind of luxury belief that the luxury class actually hold. And a human rights belief is one that we're all equal, that we should all stand together and we can all build something bigger for our future, and we need to invest in that.
I've enjoyed listening to you, and I've enjoyed it even more than I would have done if there'd been somebody else on the other side of the studio shouting about, I don't know, Jewish space lasers or whatever the rhetoric of the week may be. How can people follow your work more closely, Zoe?
Thank you, James. Thanks so much for having me on.
You're very welcome. You can see Zoe as she tweets as Zoe Jardiniere, which is the French word for gardener. You see what she did there? Yeah, it's very, very... very cosmopolitan. It's 1 minute after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 4 minutes after 11, and it's a very strange moment in British political history. A lot of people citing the ghost of Enoch Powell in reference to Suella Braverman's speech yesterday, in my view, quite fairly. But of course, the kind of notion that sort of attitude had sunk into the background was quite seductive until about 2014, 2015, I guess until Farage, who's often cited Enoch Powell as one of his heroes, until he appeared on the political scene and prompted the rolling out of various red carpets, up to, of course, and now including the Conservative Party conference. But that's as old as time itself, isn't it, the othering? I just thought Zoe was a very refreshing voice, and I hadn't clocked that. I think partly because I'm very much a creature of this environment. I hadn't clocked how important it is to listen to people who know what they're talking about without leavening out the conversation with people who don't. People who are either indulging in the deliberate deceptions or people who are motivated by things other than a search for a solution. They're motivated by personal ambition or bigotry and prejudice. So we probably will do more of that in the future. I've certainly a lot of support coming in. The lady on right now should be the next PM. Everything she said made sense, especially about working together to make the country better. And that last line there from an unsigned text brings us back to what has been going on in Manchester this week. Working together to make the country better. I don't think you have seen a tiny glimmer of working together to make the country better. You've seen a Tory politician thrown out of a Tory conference for objecting to a Tory speech. You have seen a Tory mayor expressing in the strongest terms, and terms that may yet get stronger, his outrage at the axing of the HS2 link. Do you know what's going to happen now? In many ways, this sums up the marriage of comedy and spin that typifies the modern Tory party. There is going to be an HS2 link from London to Manchester. But at Birmingham, it will move on to normal rails, which means it won't be HS anymore. But it will technically, according to them, still be HS2. So you'll be able to leave Euston and get to Birmingham in double quick time. And all of the freight capacity will be freed up, if you like, by the shift in track. But when you get to Manchester, you'll move back onto bog standard railway line. So it's HS2 to Manchester, HS2 to Birmingham, and then bog standard from Birmingham to Manchester. So you get HS2 from London to Birmingham and BS2 from Birmingham to Manchester. HS2 from London to Birmingham, BS, bog standard, or you can insert your own words there if you prefer, BS2 from Birmingham to Manchester. And Andy Street, well, again, a Tory politician who is impressive. And I know some people think you should never say things like that, but, you know, that way, cultish online celebrity lies. I'm impressed by Andy Street. I now get sent 5 texts telling me about awful things he's done in the past, or a voting, at least he won't have a voting record, will he, as a mayor? But he sounds like someone who knows what they're talking about, just like Zoe did a minute ago on the issue of immigration. And he is so cross, so unhappy about the situation regarding the axing of HS2 that there'll be an awful lot of eyes on him when Rishi Sunak completes his speech today. And that's policy. That's bad policy in his view. Bad politics historically involves backing the wrong horse or making silly decisions. It's new in this country to see lies of this scale on the conference stage. And I am returning now to the question of what's happened to your party. If you are historically a Conservative voter, what has happened to your party? How do you explain it? Not so much the ranting rhetoric of Suella Braverman, because I think, as we've just been reminded, that is as old as the hills, but the normalisation of blatant dishonesty. How has that happened? And did you think, as I did, that Rishi Sunak might actually do something about it? I don't know why I thought that, just naivety. Astonishingly damning evidence at the COVID inquiry about him completely ignoring medical advice when he announced his Eat Out to Help Out scheme. I remember saying at the time, this can't really be a good idea, can it? This notion of making us all go and sit in a restaurant together when we spent the last few months being told that we've got to stay really far apart from each other. And if he had asked for medical advice, he'd been told it was a stupid idea. But for a while, that was his lap of honour, wasn't it? So it was his endless lap of honour, arguably a lap of honour that got him into, wasn't quite pole position for the leadership of the Tory party, because, of course, he originally got beaten by the woman who subsequently got beaten by a lettuce. But here we are, on we go, 10 after 11. Ian's in Loughton. Ian, what would you like to say?
Thanks, James. My first time caller onto your programme.
Welcome aboard.
I've been Conservative voter since 79. Thatcher was my first one.
She was your gateway drug.
Well, family was always blue,
Fair enough.
so it's just a progression. But having been through Labour in the late 70s,
yeah, fair enough.
Wasn't too much of a no-brainer.
Indeedy.
I think it's just a remarkable lack of talent at the moment in the Conservative Party. They seem to be going down some very dangerous lines, which I don't think they're really thought. But I think basically when we had Corbyn in the Labour Party and everyone was worried about momentum getting back in and influencing the Labour Party, I think at the same point in time, large amounts of UKIP were moving into the Conservatives.
Hey, that's a good point.
And I don't see, and having seen quite a few generations of Conservative politicians, I have to look at the current lot, just think remarkably talentless.
Well, it was work. George Eustace was a UKIP candidate. So was Priti Patel's dad at one point.
Yeah.
So it was probably happening a little bit more in plain sight than we allowed at the time.
There's a trend that's gone on, and I think in some way there's a lot of evidence that when New Labour got ideas off the Democrats in America as to how to win elections, I think the Conservatives have been tapping into, what passes for the Republican Party in America.
Well, you mean MAGA,
There's
don't
some
you?
dangerous.
You mean MAGA. You don't mean the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan or even George W. Bush. You mean Donald Trump, and that's the scary bit because he is just a liar. That is, well, obviously he's also he's got various other sobriquets that we can add to his name now. But it is, so I'm still scared of going there, Ian. I've allowed the F word on the programme today, but they're deliberately lying because they're testing the water to see what they can get away with. Would you go that far?
They're either doing one or two things. I mean, sometimes the policies which are coming out with, but I think the rhetoric's dangerous. I think
sure.
Suella Braverman there's still people in power there in the Conservative Party that thought Liz Truss is a good idea.
Well, that's the other mad thing about this week. We haven't even touched on that. It's as if they've sort of invited Eddie the Eagle to come and give ski jump lessons a year after he was in the Olympics.
Well, the thing is, those people are still in power, whoever they may be. They're sort of men in grey suits and everything.
Yes.
But they're either, and a worrying trend that I sort of heard the other day, I think I've heard it on LBC, was that MPs used to have something like 3 months allowance. Yeah. Or if they lost their seat at an election, or didn't they not go and vote through some sort of extension, so we now get 6 months?
I don't know.
I think a lot of MPs have probably, I think a lot of Conservative MPs would probably think, well, we're toasting the next election. We're now looking for a leader.
So this is almost the rally for the next leaders, and in fact the papers are playing along. As I suggested yesterday, I think they'll fall in behind Kemi Badenoch, and the Mail reports today that she's the bookies' favourite. And it's almost as if there's not a country to govern, let alone a country in various flavours of crisis at the moment. That's the bit that's actually offensive, isn't it? The bit that sort of says, no, sorry, I'm the Home Secretary. It's more important for me to whip up the Tory base than it is to address, for example, the shoplifting epidemic.
Well, what I don't like about that is the fact that she starts talking about multiculturalism in the country, and it's a dangerous road to go down, because how would that sound? I mean, I don't know. I'm a 63-year-old white Conservative voter.
Yes.
I haven't got the lived experience of other sections of society, but how would somebody from West Indian background or Indian background who's been across here 40, 50 years, etc., start feeling about comments about multiculturalism?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question.
It's what you're saying about people from outside the country coming in for whatever reason, and if 1 in 25 are coming to get their feet wet in Calais and make it across on a boat, but 24 out of 25 come in with the full blessing of the government via an airport, Eurostar, or on a ferry.
Sure.
Then that point is, do you want to direct your comments towards that, which is worrying people, and is people see where could it go?
Yes, of course.
But at the same point in time, how does that affect multicultural people? Of somebody who might have come across a Windrush generation, who's now a grandparent.
Yeah, and you've been told that you are. Well, no, but they distinguish, don't they? There's a hierarchy. So she is evidence of integration working, and then areas where integration has been less successful are proof that multiculturalism hasn't worked, because if you move here, you must behave exactly as quotes, we, end quotes, do. I don't
know where they're going on it. It's a very, very massively complicated subject to get into when all they want is quick sound bites to get across in an election ballot.
That's what you're getting. What are you going to do then? Are you going to surrender your lifelong loyalty to the Tory party, do you think? Or is you keeping a watching brief?
I'm not too clever on Labour.
No, fair play.
I couldn't see.
79 when you went with Thatcher, and 97 being probably the two most significant elections of our lifetime. 97, a lot of people underestimate the role played by Tories who stayed at home.
Well, I did actually, because I didn't get. It was twice I didn't vote.
Yeah.
One, I was done on holiday, didn't do a postal vote. It was a Conservative landslide.
Fair enough.
And the second one was a 97 where I didn't vote, but I'd live in Woodford, Loughton area. It's Winston Churchill's old seat. He put King Kong up with a blue rosette and he's going to win it. Even this lot couldn't blow that lead.
Who is it now? Who's the MP now?
No, but the thing was, I didn't vote for him in that election because, one, it was pretty obvious it was going to be a Blair landslide.
Yeah.
But secondly, because of the Matrix Churchill affair.
Oh, of course,
when
yes.
half of cabinet, which a lot of listeners may or may not remember or not know of.
So the weapons being sent.
Half the cabinet knew those guys might go down for long prison terms because they're actually following orders from MI6.
And just kept stum.
I didn't vote out of protest. But
fair enough.
But in a general sort of thing, there's a nasty slide, and I think in some places, in some ways, Suella Braverman is touching on a few things which are raw nerves, and if we don't come up with answers.
But they're not trying to come up with answers. This is why I thought Zoe Gardner was such a good guest. I've got to crack on because it's 11:17 already. But that's the point. They're not coming up with answers. They're just competing about who can shout the loudest about how awful it all is. And that's why words like hurricane creep into the conversation. You're right. They excite the raw nerves, but answers involve conversations and compromises and hard truths sometimes. Thank you, mate. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I look forward to your next call to the programme. On the issue of lies, Emma says they don't see them as lies, though. They're trigger word clouds from focus groups, wrestled into 3-word slogans that you can lockstep crowds into. Another echo there of the F word. Indeed, as she points out, I fought with myself about using the word goose step, but they don't believe they're in the same vein as actual Nazis. It's PR, which is a tool that has no morals, which is why it's deadly in the hands of racists and fools. It is PR, isn't it? It's a bit like trying to sell you something that is going to give you the skin of a 21-year-old. It's not going to give you the skin of a 21-year-old, and you're not allowed to say that it will. The Advertising Standards Authority would clamp down on someone flogging face cream with considerable more rigour and robustness than any institution in this country. And 80 to 90% of the media will clamp down on a politician like Mark Harper for talking utter twaddle on the conference stage in Manchester, or indeed a politician like Suella Braverman for trying to resurrect the ghost of Enoch Powell.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 11, you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue to contemplate the curious condition of the modern Conservative Party. The number you need if you wish to contribute to the conversation is 0345 6060 973. And this concludes the brief outbreak of professionalism on this programme. I'll now return to my usual umming and ahhing and squeaking and squealing and interrupting to the point of enormous microphone manipulation. That gets Keith very upset. Microphone manipulations and endless interruptions. First, though, a quick trip to Pedant's Corner, which is a much friendlier place, I have to tell you, than Idiot's Corner. You can't resurrect a ghost, James. Is that true? I mean, I guess not. Well, at the point of No, you're right. I take that back. What's she trying to resurrect? She's just trying to resurrect Enoch Powell, the spirit of it. No, you can't really resurrect the spirit either. 22 minutes after 11 is the time, and Andy is in Portsmouth. Andy, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
Well, I've only ever actually voted once in my life. I'm 41 years old now.
Gosh.
And it was at the last general election. And there were two reasons why I voted the way I did. One was for Brexit, and two was for the fact that I own a small business, and the Conservatives have always been played as the friend to the small business person. But after the recent, with COVID, Partygate and all that,
Yes.
I wouldn't vote Conservative again if my life depended on it.
Why not? Well, you don't gloss over it, because COVID, Partygate, you got the Brexit you wanted, didn't you?
Well, did I? Again, it was. I was something was mislabelled.
Yes.
Shall we say?
Yeah, fair enough. If it was PPI, you'd be entitled to compensation, and LBC would be full of adverts giving you phone numbers to ring. But unfortunately, politics doesn't work like that.
No, it doesn't. I don't think anyone's got the Brexit that they wanted. Even hardcore Brexiteers now saying, "Well, no, maybe it was, it was wrong." It was just Boris Johnson's a good salesman.
Yeah, very good
That's all
point.
it came down
Absolutely
to.
right. Yes.
He could sell ice to Eskimos, but now it's like I said, I would never vote Conservative again. I made this decision a couple of years ago actually after the whole Partygate thing came out, and I was like, how dare you stand at a rostrum every day telling us that we can't see our friends, we can't see our families, we can't go out, we can't live normal lives, and yet you're basically living your best life in the basement of Number 10.
They really were. And of course, all the newspapers, all the right-wing newspapers, and sadly quite a lot of broadcasters as well, were queuing up to tell you, Andy, that you didn't care about Partygate. Nobody cared about it, and that it was all an exaggeration or a witch hunt. It was a witch hunt, wasn't it?
Was work meetings, and
that was it.
And Boris Johnson was the best thing since sliced bread.
I think that affected a lot of people, actually. But it makes it even more surprising that you've still got the 27% support in place. I guess getting rid of Johnson would have, for some people, that would have been enough to get rid of the stench that you described. So why for you did getting rid of Johnson not bring you back into the fold, as it were?
I think because it wasn't just Johnson. It was like the Matt Hancock scandal, the contracts, the PPE. It was the waste of money, people dying. The NHS has been stripped to its bare bones for years, and it's I think, like myself, a lot of people have just had enough. Like the whole, everyone's banging on about HS2 and the billions it will save by not doing it. Okay, so where's that money going to go? Where's all the money that we are supposed to be saving by not being part of the European Union again? The ads for the run-up to the vote for Brexit was, we will save £50 million. It was either per day or per week.
Yeah.
Where's that money?
It was 350 million a week, wasn't it, on the side of the bus?
Yeah. So 50 million per day.
Yeah.
What could you do with £50 million per day in the NHS?
Presumably quite a lot.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, I'm not saying that. I am going to vote Labour in the next general election. I'm not saying I've got 100% faith in Keir Starmer, because,
no one does, mate.
I think he's a bit of a yes man.
Yeah.
I think if he had any common sense and he really wanted Labour to win, I think he should hand the reins over to Angela Rayner.
Do you really? That's
Yes.
That's quite a journey you've been on, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Angela Rayner, she's what, she's young, she's a go-getter, she doesn't take any rubbish off of anyone.
You're absolutely right. On the other hand, she would frighten the horses. So other swing voters would be more perturbed by her than they are by Starmer's apparent sort of timidity. She's almost too much of the things you've just described for some people. So carrying a Ming vase across an ice rink, which is what the Labour Party is doing at the moment, is arguably he's a better man for that job, the Ming vase carrying mission, than Angela would be.
The thing is, what I think, Angela Rayner is what this country sorely needs, because some people will look at her and go, she's a bit Maggie Thatcherish, just with a red ribbon instead of a blue ribbon.
I like that. I don't know that she would.
Well, no, she probably wouldn't.
But you mean strength? You mean strength of conviction, let alone strength of personality.
She has the will to get things done and do what's right. And I think what's right is, I'm not going to bore you with HS2 or migrants or anything. I think we need to just, get back on track, get the NHS fixed for a start.
That was a big part. We forget that was a big part of '97. That pledge, and the numbers back it up as well. I mean, it's a bigger mountain to climb in 2024 than it was in 1997. But Labour do have the record on that. Andy, mate, thank you. I've enjoyed the last two calls particularly. Nothing wrong with all the previous calls either, but listening to people describing a swinging of the needle when an awful lot of political conversation and coverage is quite entrenched, isn't it? It comes from positions that often appear to be immovable. That's why I think we should pay more attention to politicians that actually make decisions based on conscience, that actually cross the floor or change party, not for personal ambition, but for reasons of principle. That feels a little unfashionable. Thank you to Andy. Thank you also to everybody who is working on the correct phraseology of my Enoch Powell, Suella Braverman point. You could invoke the spirit of Enoch Powell, says Phil in Shropshire, whereas you could summon the ghost, says Martin in Blackburn. Those are both better ways of describing it. You're quite right. And Mark in Tooting reminds us that it was Jacob Rees-Mogg who described Partygate as fluff. So the events that were enough to turn our last caller against the Tory party, quite possibly for the rest of his life, Jacob Rees-Mogg is still describing as fluff. And of course a witch hunt, something for which I think he was criticised by an actual select committee. It's coming up to 11:29. You're listening in to LBC, listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That little stumble there is because Rishi Sunak's due to speak a little earlier than I was expecting, so we're expecting that speech in Manchester to begin in just over 10 minutes. That's the number they've given. It very rarely happens like that, but with a conference speech and an early start, it may. We'll catch up with Henry Riley, who I think is in Manchester for LBC, because Natasha Clark, our political editor, will be bagsying a seat in the hall after the very latest news headlines. The time now is 11:30, and Thomas Watts has those headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:32 is the time. Speech from Rishi Sunak it's going to happen today. Almost certainly in the next 40 minutes, possibly in 7. There's 3 different theories on this, I'm told. Henry Riley thinks 11:50. Natasha, our political editor, thinks 12. And the BBC is currently saying 11:40. So you takes your pick. You pays your money, you takes your pick. I don't know. Oh, Henry thinks 12. Oh, I'm getting so confused. Natasha thinks 11:50. It doesn't really matter, does it? So BBC 11:40. LBC's political editor. And Sky's gone for shortly. So I feel I should join in. I'm going to say imminently. Imminently. Imminently is quite a big envelope, isn't it? You can stuff a lot into imminently. Anyway, Rishi Sunak due to give his speech imminently. We will be taking it live on LBC. And we'll be catching up with Henry shortly about events in Manchester and likely contents of the speech. Penny Mordaunt currently making her leadership bit. I mean, currently delivering her speech to conference. And I'm told that Johnny Mercer is up next. He's always good fun. But it is Rishi Sunak upon whom some eyes will be focused imminently. 11:34 is the time. Martin is in Rotherham. Martin, what's happened to the Conservative Party?
Hi, James. Nice to speak to you. So I'm a Labour voter nowadays, but I have floated in the past, and you probably, I don't know how much you're aware, but where I live, it all changed the last time round.
Redwall Central.
Yeah, it's a weird area to be in because I've got a Tory MP. By rights, doesn't really mean much to my area. But the problem is that they're not really Tory MPs. They're like UKIP MPs in disguise. And he's been on the TV this morning, my local MP, and his sort of he says that her speech yesterday was the tone of the neighbourhood, which for me is a bit frightening because that says to me that all my neighbours are racists, are xenophobic, somebody who's from the LGBT community. That worries me. And I think we're kind of assuming that it's not going to get voted again, and there's going to be a change of MPs in some of our areas. But where I live, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're stuck with him.
What are the numbers like? Do you remember? What was the majority? I'm trying to think.
It was quite high. I think it was about 60-40 or something like that. I think it was higher than we expected. I mean,
who is your local MP? You don't have because is it Rother Valley?
Yeah, it's Rother Valley. So it's
Alexander Stafford. Yes, he's another one of those sort of slightly. I don't know. I don't think anyone was expecting them to win, really, were
they? They're basically, kind of. I've had a bit of a run-in with him in the past about things, basically doing the whole dog whistle type thing, and I'd stick up for somebody, and it's like, but it's not. He's playing to who his voters are. He doesn't do anything for improving the area.
But the voters who didn't like Jeremy Corbyn and who wanted to get Brexit done, usually in that order, and then had concerns about immigration, but they were usually tied to Brexit. I don't know how big that constituency is. I don't mean the constituency of Rother Valley. I mean nationally. I don't know how many bricks there are in the red wall, to be honest with you.
I don't think it's changed that much.
Do you not?
I think people still think.
But the Tories do, because 30p Leanock said that we can't do what we did last time. We can't campaign on Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn because both of those ships have sailed, and we can't. I mean, he would consider Boris Johnson to be possessed of a sort of electoral Viagra, which the numbers don't support. But this isn't a generation of Tories that cares much about facts or figures. So those things have gone. But you think that the culture war rhetoric is probably going to work? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Because in Rotherham, for example, you've got the CSE scandal that's still kind of rumbling on, which is what he keeps picking away at and suggesting that the local Labour Council is useless.
I think Braverman did a bit of that yesterday, which it's not your children who will be groomed. I don't know who she's talking to when she says that, but it's that kind of rhetoric is inflammatory.
It's basically divisive politics in this area, and it's quite frightening, I think, because it doesn't serve the locals any favours at all. It's okay for people who are outside of needing anything that the government would provide, which there's probably quite a few people in this area that are quite sort of, they've done all right for themselves. They don't have huge bills. Well, they have worse bills than they had. But
yes.
Do you know what I mean? Their heads are above the water. But for people maybe that are not quite like that, I mean, I'm not poor, but I feel the pinch, and I work with people who really do feel the pinch.
And they're not hearing anything, and they're not. Well, we shall see, because the polls. You've got a 20% lead now, give or take, for Labour in most of the polls this week. So you may get some unexpected news up there. I don't know. The point being, of course, that the calculation between culture war and traditional politics is a clear and present one. Speaking of odd interventions, Penny Mordaunt keeps saying during her speech to conference that Labour wants to return the UK to the disaster of the 1980s. She's going to have kittens when she finds out who was in power for the entirety of that decade, isn't she? Henry Riley wasn't even born. He joins me now, live from Manchester. What's going on, Henry?
Oh, it's pretty quiet, to be honest, James. It's a peculiar atmosphere, really, because of the train strikes. ASLEF are on strike today, meaning that there are no trains running. So a load of party members and indeed journalists as well. Actually, some politicians have had to get the train back yesterday evening. So when it's normally sort of bustling, fizzing in here with excitement, it really isn't at the moment. It's pretty subdued, pretty quiet. A lot of the members I've been speaking with, not particularly happy, it has to be said. They really think Rishi Sunak has to pull some sort of rabbit out of the hat today and try and galvanise them in some way, because they're feeling pretty uninspired at the moment.
What might that rabbit look like?
Well, something that's not HS2. I think he needs to get that out the way. It's dominated conference. I mean, quite how they've allowed an issue that they don't want to talk about to dominate the conference is baffling. It's an issue that they hadn't made their mind up, we hear, until a few days ago, and somehow it's been allowed to rumble on to the point where ministers who've been doing broadcasters have been asked about it repeatedly, which I'm sure they're very grateful for. But we understand he's going to act the Birmingham to Manchester leg. That's on a pure aspect because of cost, but the Prime Minister will also add in that he wants to improve connectivity between east to west and improve connectivity in the north in other ways as opposed to just from Old Oak Common, although we hear that is now off the table. It is going to go from Euston. Yes, Old Oak Common, that idea that was floated did not go down particularly well, so they've decided to ditch that. And then except from that, I mean, there were a few rumours that smoking, there could be some new, there'd be some new legislation with regards to clamping down on smoking and making us essentially a smoke-free country in a few years.
Is that a rabbit?
Not really.
It's more of a hamster.
What's curious, James, is in previous years you talk with special advisors and they'll give you the line, well, we don't want to preempt the Prime Minister's speech, but this and this. This year, and indeed former Prime Ministers, I think back a couple of years, who were very proud of their speech before they'd even delivered it and would often brief out some of the lines that were going to be key points.
Of course.
That hasn't happened this year. We honestly, it's pretty thin on the ground in terms of what the Prime Minister will say. We understand it's going to be 8,000 words, 40 minutes, so there should be some substance in there. But in terms of what we in there, I mean, we hear it's going to be very personal. You hear that literally every time a Prime Minister makes a conference speech. We know about Rishi Sunak's backstory and working at the pharmacy with his mum doing.
Probably not going to be much on the Goldman Sachs years, I don't imagine, in this personal speech that he's
No,
giving.
I don't expect that to feature heavily. I think in terms of the lighter side, because they often Boris Johnson came out with a sort of Michael Gove. Michael Gove was filmed Clubbing famously last year, and he said it's John Bon Jovi. And I think in terms of that humour that Rishi Sunak perhaps doesn't possess, he may well rely on Star Wars references. He often does that because he's a huge Jedi fan. Southampton FC is another one of his loves. Cricket. I suspect any light moments will really focus on those three things.
But no rabbits, really. I mean, what about immigration policy? Could he announce, because they've kind of shot their bolt on that, really, with Rwanda and all the rest of it, and the barge. I don't think there's anyone on the barge. No one's gone to Rwanda. I mean, he could throw the dice and go for the hat trick of really big headline-grabbing immigration policies that never actually happen. But apart from that, I don't know what looks like a rabbit in Manchester this week.
I think immigration's the most likely. I was at the launch of the New Conservatives on Monday, which, just to remind you, in case you're lost with the various political factions of the Conservative Party, this is the group run by Danny Kruger and a few other.
Well, now hang on a minute, because we couldn't get the clip of him because I think it happened in a fringe meeting. But he's the one that's been talking about a new world government.
Well, and it was in that meeting where that word was used. He was also, he was on Andrew Marr's programme yesterday evening as well, warning about sort of global institutions like the World Health Organisation. And it was peculiar, the event. I mean, Tom Hunt, the MP for Ipswich, got a lot of flack for a comment he made about xenophobia as well at that particular meeting.
He said that he didn't feel he was in his own country when he walked down the street or something, didn't he?
He said, it's not xenophobic for people to walk into their town centre and to I forget the way he phrased it exactly, but essentially they're not racist for going in and not feeling like they're
racist for complaining
about
how many people there are who are a different colour from them.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
but the New Conservatives, the launch they had was one of their key policies was halving immigration, which actually, when you look at a lot of the factions, considering it was running at 600,000 net last year, it's not completely unachievable. It was around 250,000 a couple of years ago. So I think that's quite headline grabbing in terms of halving immigration. That could be an angle Sunak goes down. And Suella Braverman in her speech yesterday was going on about shutting the hotels that are currently housing asylum seekers. Could Rishi Sunak announce that in the coming days some of those will start to close? Have they made any progress? The bill is absolutely huge, running at £8 million a day or just below that. So I think in terms of red meat, it may well be that.
It may be. What about the 5 pledges? I mean, could he do an update on them, do you think? Would that be rhetorically powerful, or would it actually be quite embarrassing for him? Has anyone mentioned the pledges while you've been in Manchester? Are there big pledge stones up all over the conference centre?
No, to be fair, there's no pledge stones. I'm trying to look around and see if there's any.
Trick there, mate.
I'm right by the Conservative shop, and I've been keenly watching what's been coming and going. They've got all the memorabilia. But
what's selling quickest, do you think? What's selling like hotcakes?
Well, Greg Hands said that the Keir Starmer flip-flops had sold out, but Natasha Clark and I had a look earlier, and they're fully stocked. So
there you go. That's the Tory party in a nutshell, mate.
They've still got them at $16.99, which
it's a very funny joke to have some flip-flops.
Oh, crikey, deep pockets or what? So that was incredible. But Greg Hands, the reason I mentioned that, did mention the 5 pledges. I think the Prime Minister will have an argument to say on inflation that it's come down to 6.7%. He could argue he's on his way to 5%, although it does look like that's going to be increasingly challenging. On small boats, Suella Braverman was keen to suggest yesterday that they've gone down by around 25% on this time last year. It's not quite stopping the boats, but I imagine he might cling on to that. And NHS waiting list, I suspect he might not want to mention that because that's gone up hugely as well since he became Prime Minister. So in terms of the pledges, I think a sprinkling of a few of them might well be mentioned, but perhaps not the whole shebang.
Henry Riley, lovely stuff. Still no rabbits, but possibly a couple of hamsters. We shall keep our eyes peeled. What is a mini rabbit? It's not really a hamster, is it? Would it be a gerbil? I don't know. I don't know. I can tell you now that Natasha Clark has come down on the Henry Riley side of the question of what time this is going to start. And listen, I know this is very, very pot kettle, but the current speaker is Johnny Mercer, who does rather enjoy the sound of his own voice. So I think it's now 11:45. 12 noon looks like a likely beginning for the Prime Minister's speech, although, of course, he speaks more as leader of the Tory party than he does as Prime Minister. My favourite ever? Have you got a favourite ever? It's got to be Theresa May's, hasn't it? That was just it was unbelievable. So she came on doing the boogie. That's the bit that Keith remembers. And then she started coughing. And you've caught me a couple of times. Think of all the years that I've been bombarding you with my balderdash every morning. And there's a couple of times when I've had a cough, right? And I've told you that I've got a cough, or you've seen me take a sip out of my enormous mug, or I've had to kind of press a button. I've got a button. It actually says cough on it so that I can cough without annoying. But that cough of Theresa May's, that was like an anxiety dream, not a cough. It's every sort. Oh, it was absolutely terrible. And as that unfolded, letters started falling off the backdrop behind her. It was truly incredible. It was like the denouement of a film, as opposed to a speech from a politician. The letters falling off the backdrop behind her. A terrible cough. Philip Hammond gave her a strepsil, and then a prankster got up on stage and gave her a fake P45. It was disaster after disaster after a disaster. And it was only 6 years ago. And in those 6 years, the Conservative Party has been on such a journey that yesterday, instead of chucking out a prankster that had handed the Prime Minister a fake P45, they chucked out the Conservative leader of the London Assembly.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10 to 12, you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and we are contemplating the state of the Tory party and waiting for the leader of the Tory party to mount the conference stage in Manchester and deliver his speech, which may, of course, be his final speech, as his final conference speech as leader, or his last speech, at least before the next general election. Some people expecting it to unfold roughly this time next year. In fact, I think that's where most of the clever money is. Is Theresa May's legacy to politics in this country that conferences now have digital signage behind speakers instead of pinned up letters? It might be. I mean, I can think of worse legacies, but also that can go wrong as well. I've always got digital signage surrounding me. I've got digital signage to the left of me, digital signage to the right of me, digital signage behind me, and digital signage in front of me. And it can sometimes go wrong. It can also be hacked or sabotaged. Keith could put all manner of obscene imagery behind me as I share my daily thoughts with you, but obviously he would never. What did we just do? He would never do such a thing. Back to the question of what's happened to the party. James is in Brittany. James, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, James.
Basically, it's been taken over, and in a very similar way to the way the Republicans are being taken over by the Tea Party using Donald Trump.
Yes.
Watching Nigel Farage yesterday around the conference, he's got what he wants. Basically, UKIP aren't in power officially, but
they might as well.
Then again, they might as well be.
I suppose we should be careful what we complain about, because UKIP in power, but not him. I suppose it's better than UKIP in power plus him.
James O'Brien on LBC.